Welcome back. Today we're diving deep into something huge, really complex, maybe a bit uncomfortable: global poverty. We're aiming to look beyond just the numbers, trying to connect the dots between these massive global economic systems, deep historical injustices, and those really determined local struggles for equity that are happening right now.
Exactly. And our sources today, they really push us to challenge the stories we usually hear. The goal is to understand systemic poverty not just as like an economic problem, but as a political condition, something that was historically created and is actively kept in place. We really have to scrutinize that mainstream success narrative.
Okay, let's start there with that success story. Because you hear it a lot, right? From big international organizations, the World Bank, for instance. They report global poverty dropped by 36% since 1990. That means, supposedly, 1.1 billion people escaped poverty. It's often framed as proof the global system is working.
It is a compelling headline, no doubt. But what the sources suggest is that this miracle might be more about changing how we measure poverty than a massive, real change in people's lives. And if you look
Yeah.
closer, even the World Bank itself now says, well, the pace of poverty reduction has really slowed down. And maybe even more crucially, they're pointing out how climate change could just wipe out those gains, potentially pushing poverty numbers back up significantly.
Hmm. So, if 3 decades of pretty intense economic growth didn't actually solve the problem, this model Andy Sumner's calls catch-up capitalism, the rapid industrialization pushed after the Cold War, then maybe the growth model itself has some fundamental flaws.
Well, it certainly makes you question what economic activity is for. Our sources bring up this concept, immiserizing growth. It's not new. Jagdish Bhagwati talked about it way back in 1958. It describes these situations where, yes, there's economic growth, but it's canceled out by the terms of trade deals linked to it. So growth happens, but it doesn't lead to prosperity for most people. It can actually increase poverty in some places.
Wait, let me just get this straight. You're saying a country's GDP could go up, but because of how the deals are structured, maybe resource extraction or certain tariffs, the end result is more people end up poor. The system itself uses growth to make poverty worse.
That's the hard truth these sources point to. Poverty isn't just bad luck, it's historically made. It got built right at that intersection of the global and the local, driven by these huge twin forces: capitalization and colonization. And this isn't recent history. We're talking roots going back to the 1500s in Europe. Economic growth there was tied up with enclosing common land, developing overseas colonies. You had the pursuit of wealth for a few, directly creating more poverty and inequality everywhere else.
Wow. And the efforts to fix that, like after World War II, decolonization, modernization projects, and industrialization, they didn't actually break that old pattern.
It seems they often just continued colonial ways of doing things, especially in how resources were managed, how labor was treated. The philosopher Bruno Latour even called the whole development project the latest wave of colonization. It really hammers home the point. Poverty is political, fundamentally. It comes down to choices made by powerful global players about who gets what, where resources go, how things are run.
Okay, tracing it back that far to the 16th century, that really reframes what we call modern poverty. And given how huge and, well, dense those systems are, the sources really stress grounding this whole issue in local reality. Stats are useful, but they become dehumanizing if you don't have the narratives behind the numbers.
Absolutely essential. Local histories are crucial because that's how communities defend their own values against the sheer weight and, frankly, the erasing effect of these big global historical forces. History becomes a defense tool.
Can you give some examples? Where is history really acting as that kind of shield?
Oh, you see it across the Americas. Think about the quilombos in Brazil communities started by people who escaped slavery, or indigenous communities in Mexico. They're using their specific documented histories to back up claims to land and resources against big capitalist projects like huge farms or mines. Their history is literally their legal standing.
That's incredible. History as a living land claim.
Yeah. And you also see it in social defense, like marginalized Roma communities in Eastern Europe. Their history acts as a collective memory, helping maintain their way of life, defending their right to exist against official hostility. Or in Bangladesh, collective histories help keep local values and identity alive when people are forced to move climate change, economic pressures, and have to build new communities from scratch.
And that defense, that use of local history, it seems to feed directly into community organizing, right? The materials highlight that organizing is maybe uniquely necessary now, with socioeconomic inequalities just getting worse everywhere: housing, schools, safety, health.
Right. And we can actually see how organizing builds real power. There's this debate, the socialization hypothesis, the idea that organizing itself makes people more civically engaged, versus the selection hypothesis, which just says, well, only people who are already super engaged join these groups anyway.
So which idea does the research support?
Well, there was this study looking at faith-based organizing, tracking people over 2 years. And yeah, these folks started out highly engaged, sure, but the study found they became significantly more involved over time, and they reported feeling like they had more control, sociopolitically speaking. So that strongly supports the idea that organizing builds power and political skill. It doesn't just attract people who already have it.
But taking on entrenched systems, whether it's, I don't know, a local school board or it's some global corporation that takes cuts, it involves real risk. The sources talk about cultivating habits of courage.
Yeah, and that courage isn't simple. Organizers face different kinds of risks. There are internal risks, like within the group, having the courage to ask tough questions that might cause tension, or being vulnerable enough to share a personal, maybe painful story. Then there are the external risks facing powerful opposition, like anti-fracking movements in Bulgaria or the Menominee Nation protecting their land from developers. That takes enormous courage. But maybe the most fundamental courage needed is the courage to confront and overcome that feeling of powerlessness within yourself.
That feeling of powerlessness.
Sure.
It's often reinforced by the dominant story, isn't it? As communities organize, they bump up against systems designed to control what we all see and know. Which brings us to these spaces, cracks, and fissures, where resistance happens, what the sources call the interstices.
Exactly. The interstices. Think of them as the perforated base of society. These are spaces inside the main power structure where, kind of under the radar, subversive things can happen. Alternatives can emerge and even thrive mutual aid groups, community gardens, maybe independent local economies.
And the dominant corporate media seems to be a key tool power uses to manage this story around these spaces, right? It seems like the media mostly shows us commercial space shoppers, celebrities, markets, and that effectively erases these other interstitial spaces from the narrative.
Pretty much. If you're not buying something or famous, you barely exist in that mainstream view. We can really break this down using the lens of the propaganda model, especially that idea of worthy versus unworthy victims. It reveals a deep political bias.
Okay, give us a clear example of a worthy victim.
Right. So when someone is harmed in an enemy state, they become worthy. They get huge amounts of media coverage, dramatic, repeated coverage. The sources detail the 1984 murder of Jerzy Popusko, a Polish priest by the communist state. The media coverage was massive. They printed loads of detail about his body, the wounds, the crime scene, all clearly designed to stir up maximum outrage against the Soviet bloc.
But the opposite happens when the perpetrator is, say, a U.S. ally or a client state.
Exactly. Then the victims become unworthy. Take the 1980 murders of 4 American churchwoman nuns, lay workers in El Salvador. El Salvador's government back then was heavily backed by the U.S. and involved in what some called a war of extermination and genocide. But the coverage of the murders, minimal, brief, suppressed. Key details that would have caused public outcry, like one victim's face being destroyed or the killers using their underwear, those details were left out. The media seemed careful not to implicate the U.S.-backed government.
And this political bias also shows up in how words like aggression get used or not used in global conflicts. The media had no problem calling the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan aggression or talking about genocide regarding certain actions in Yugoslavia, for example.
But compare that to the massive U.S. war in Indochina. Between 61 and 71, the U.S. Air Force dropped 20 million gallons of toxic stuff like Agent Orange on 6 million acres in South Vietnam. That's like 13% of the country's land. Yet the media never called this huge chemical warfare campaign aggression. No, it was framed as protecting South Vietnam from internal aggression. It's pretty compelling evidence that mainstream media often just accepts the basic propaganda lines of the governments they're supposed to be watching critically.
And this corporate bias, it also affects how social movements challenging the economic quo get covered. You see protests against groups like the WTO, the IMF, the World Bank, often facing real hostility in the media.
Yeah, look at the Seattle WTO protests in 1999. Media coverage consistently played up protester violence, sometimes exaggerating it while downplaying or ignoring illegal actions by the police. And this makes sense in a way because the media itself represents corporate interests, so it naturally lines up against the public when the public opposes things like trade deals, like NAFTA back then. The editorials, the experts they chose to quote, heavily skewed towards the elite view, ignoring widespread public opposition.
So pulling this all together, what does it mean for us? We've looked at how poverty was historically constructed, tracing it back to capitalization and colonization, forces still at play. We've seen how vital local resistance is, using collective history and community organizing to build actual political power from the bottom up. And then we examine the systemic challenge from a commercially driven media that often works to erase or distort the stories of that resistance.
I think the main lesson, really reinforced by all the sources we looked at, is that poverty is fundamentally a political condition. It's actively maintained. It's not some unavoidable economic fate. It absolutely can be resisted and changed by using those local histories, building collective power, and constantly challenging the dominant narratives that try to hide or twist that struggle.
The sources mentioned the COVID crisis and how its impacts were so profoundly unequal. Symptomatic, they said, of this underlying sickness of poverty in society. History teaches us that poverty is often the outcome of specific political choices. So we want to leave you with this question to think about. What specific political choices are being made right now in your own country or globally about who gets resources, whose story gets told in the media, how global systems are run? Choices that history might eventually judge as creating or reinforcing poverty, something to mull over until our next deep dive.